Hello and welcome to Ever-Chosen Minis. Today I'm going to show you a conversion I did for a client that shows off the extreme creativity that kit bashing lets us have in this hobby. For this commission, I was tasked with converting Nagash, Supreme Lord of the Undead, into Sukuna from the popular anime Jujutsu Kaisen. Now, I needed to maintain the undead lich aesthetic that Nagash has, but modify him to be instantly recognizable as the powerful sorcerer Sukuna. In this video, I'm just going to show you the steps I took to make that happen and create this one-of-a-kind model for the tabletop. To start this conversion, I built the legs and torso following the instructions. We're going to be making some pants for this model, kind of leaning into the robed aesthetic that our villains depicted it most of the time in the manga. This is actually a very easy step, but is a very transformative step that will be used several times in this conversion. First, I start by tracing some pants around the size that I need from a sturdy and unpatterned napkin. Next, I just take a sharp X-Acto knife to cut out the pants and lay the pieces out neatly. And now that we have our pattern set, we want to be able to adhere it to the model. For this, we use Mod Podge. This is a non-toxic, slow-drying glue that we water down slightly. We just brush this over the pieces, and you want to kind of reach a sweet spot between damp enough it'll cling to the model, but not so wet that it'll slide off. This can happen if you put too much water in it, and then you'll kind of just need to wait for that piece to dry out a little bit before you can put it on. But as you can see in the video, this step is very forgiving and gives you a lot of working time. So you can definitely kind of tease the fabric and make the folds that you're going to be wanting. Now, the technique itself naturally makes folds and gives a convincing cloth look without having to sculpt everything out in grease and stuff. But we will need to let this dry overnight, however. And I do go back a few hours later and apply a layer of the same glue over the top of it, just for strength. Once it's dry, though, you're left with a very durable, semi-flexible finish that's perfect for cloth. Now that the pants are finished, it's time to move on to one of the more unique features of Sukuna. If you're familiar with the show or the manga, he has a second mouth on his stomach that chants spells and incantation while he's fighting. And while I'm not the best sculptor, I am going to show you how you can make more complex features on your miniatures and the steps that I took to make this feature on the model. I start by making up some green stuff in Milliput, two separate putties popular for miniature sculpting. They both have their strengths, but I find making these complex shapes a little bit easier. Mixing them one-to-one gives the best results. Now I'm going to start pretty much with a ball of this on the torso. Luckily this model has a withered, mummified torso that gives a lot of space to sculpt around. And as you can see here, I'm just gently making an opening and slowly forming the two foundations of the mouth. Next I add bits to be the teeth and blend them into the front of the two halves, giving him canines and adding to the demonic appearance. Now, the secret to making these complex shapes is knowing when to let what you have finished dry. I let what I have so far dry overnight, come back to add the lips over the teeth. This allows me to sculpt a little bit more confidently without having to worry so much about ruining my previous work. And after we let the lips dry, I come back with one last pass to add the remaining teeth. For this, I use just pure green stuff, and I slowly work these pieces into shape, carving out the teeth, and then the mouth is finished, and we can move on to our next part of the conversion. Now, me and my infinite wisdom forgot to record making the new head that's on the finished model. So I will show you the video of the original head that was remade due to the scale being off. Now, there are two main features on the head that we want to create that will make the model look like our intended villain. The first will be the iconic pink hair, and the second will be his strange bone-like growth that contains two eyes on his right side. Both these steps were very easy. The base skull that was used for this conversion came from the OBR terrain piece, as the original Nagash head is just too small to use. The hair itself was made simply by taking clippers to a layer of green stuff over the skull until the texture resembled spiky hair. I play around a little bit with some of the strands to make them line up and give a little bit more natural look. And then the growth on the skull was handled by placing a small ball of putty on the skull and forming 2 holes with my sculpting tool. In the finalized version, I do end up coming back after it's dry and I carve edges to give it a little bit sharper and more sinister appearance overall. Next, I'm going to make his 2 iconic weapons, a uniquely shaped dagger and a 3-pronged spear or trident. Both of these conversions were pretty easy to make, but in order to keep with the undead lich theme, I needed to get creative and make sure that we kept the same rough silhouette but gave off that undead feel. Now, the easier of the 2 weapons was definitely the spear. I used the same staff as the kit and the base, but just cut it down from the top. After cutting it flush, I do the same with the sword option and then just glue the 2 parts together, making a spear. Now, Sukuna's spear features multiple blades with small curves toward the tips, and after looking through my bits bin, I found some Eldar swords that I cut the blades off to make them ready for attachment. And to give these blades the flat surface they need to adhere to, I simply cut the skulls at the end of the crossguard, leaving a flat section to glue the blades to. For the knife, I wanted to keep the strange kind of spears at the end of the hilt, but wanted to make it look like it was wielded by the Lord of the Undead. To make this happen, I start with a piece of spine-looking bone from the staff head that we cut off earlier, and to make the spears on the end, I cut off 2 of the Necropolis Stalker's head from the OBR range. These provide the correct silhouette and are perfect for the vibe that we're going for. After gluing the heads to the end of the hilt, I finished the conversion with a blade from the Space Marines kit on top of one of the heads, and I hold off on attaching the spear to the left arm and opt to go ahead and fix the knife into the right hand. Now that we have most of the conversion out of the way, I'm going to tackle the more transformative one that's required to truly sell this model. For those who don't watch the show, I'm talking about the second set of arms that this man has. Sukuna's ultimate and true form uses these arms to cast curse techniques and attack his enemies. But today we're going to be depicting the most powerful of those moves, the Domain Expansion. Now, the work was too small to really film well, so I'm going to show you on screen just still shots of the hands that he's supposed to have and the hands that I ended up doing. This was just really tedious work. I had to cut the hands from the OBR manifestation up into little tiny pieces and just glue back every joint that made the fingers so I could curl them in certain ways and kind of make them work for this. So once we get the hands ready, it's time to attach the arms and the second set of arms to the model. Now, for the primary set of arms, I glued the left arm as per the instructions, but the right arm was just given a little bit of green stuff into the joint to allow me to pose it and have it stretch out a little bit more, just to make a little bit more room for the second set. Moving on to the lower set of arms, it comes from that same manifestation spell that the hands did, and we're going to fix them into place with some super glue and green stuff. As you can see here, I'm being very, very careful on how I place the arms and attach the hands. After posing the model and gluing the hands together, just to create a little bit stronger bond, I leave them completely overnight just to make sure they are solid before we actually finish them up. Now to finish the arms, and this part of the conversion for the model, I use the same method as the pants to create sleeves for the arms and blend them into the sleeves of the original model. This took a lot of fussing and even starting over on one of the arms, but once I got them in place, I allowed them to dry again before finishing the robes on the back, getting covered in cloth. Now, one thing I love about this method is how easy it is to come back and layer on top of what you did, allowing you to build up these complex shapes in an easy and strong way. With that, the steps are finally finished and we are done with the conversions for this model, and we can move on to painting. Alright, now that we have an amazing looking converted model, it's going to be on to painting. So to start, we're going to give this model a Zenithal highlight. This almost finishes the robes as well as provide a great base for our contrast paints that we're going to use. I base coat the armor in Slaughter Red, and if you've seen my videos in the past, you know I use Slaughter Red for just about everything due to its excellent coverage and very deep finish that it has. Now, for this step and all the others, I try to be very careful around the white robes. And to do the mouth, I water down that same Slaughter Red. It kind of turns it into a rich pink color, and I spread this over the lips and tongue. Again, just trying to avoid the white areas that we want, like the teeth. And then moving on to the bones, I use Skeletal Horde from Games Workshop, just really watered down, and that'll give us the base tone of pretty much all the bone for this model. And now that we have our base colors on, I can kind of focus on finishing the armor, which I do a thick edge highlight of Mephiston Red, making sure not to overbrush onto certain parts that I still want dark. And then after we do that one highlight, we're going to darken everything back down with a wash of Agrath's Earthshade. This is going to help deepen the shadow and boost that contrast that we want. And then to finish this armor, I just use a very thin highlight of Wild Wider Red onto the edges, just trying to stay within that previous highlight. Now to focus on the bones, I take Iraqi sand from Model Color and mix it 50-50 with ivory from Pro Acryl. This gives me a subtle highlight that I apply in very, very thin layers, building up the highlights to the highest point. The layers dry pretty fast, but it helps you build up really good gradients whenever you layer it up like this, and it'll help you transition that highlight. Now to make the armor pop, I add a bronze to the trim. I do this very slowly and carefully to make sure I get the best results. If you mess up with metallics, even with the damp brush to clean it up, you can get flakes that get left behind that you just don't want. Now, the client wanted this changed to copper after the fact, so off camera I just did the same step with Celestance Bronze. And the client also wanted the spear changed, so I wasn't able to get that filmed on camera. I just forgot. Uh, but essentially, the end product, it was just an airbrush of white and then a hand mixing between contrast yellow and red paints that were just blended together over the blade to form the orange in the middle. So that part was really easy. With all the main sections done, it's down to clean up for the robes. I take pure white and go over the spots that I overspilled during painting. And to enhance the robes further, I highlight all the edges with that same white, and then take a very watered down gray to the shadows. And this will help boost our contrast overall on the mini. And then to wrap up all of our painting steps for this miniature, I just go ahead and paint in some minor details, like putting black between the gaps in his armor, filling out the hair with some magenta paint, which just has a wash and then a little bit of white mixed with that magenta to give it those final highlights. And then I make a few markings over the skull and tongue just to match the tattoos that our main villain Sukuna has. Now for a model this special, a fantastic base is required, and what better to use than the iconic domain expansion of our main villain, Malevolent Shrine. This shrine would be almost impossible to create this well by hand, so I did have some help, and my friend over at 3D FPS LLC printed off this amazing model of the shrine, along with the skulls that I used to kind of tie it into the base. To start, I want to build up some height so that we have an island in the middle surrounded by a sea of blood. To do this, I use corkboard broken up into some interesting shapes and glue our sculpt on top. Now this print has a lip that needs to be blended into the ground. And to do this, I mix pine bark and milliput to sculpt the general shape on the ground. But before that dries, I do take some fake plant stems to act as dead trees and just push them into the putty. Next, I glue and squish a ton of little skulls, helping blend the pile of bones on the shrine to the base and add some general interest around the base. Now to finish off the ground, I use some winter ground texture paste over the milliput and around the skulls. Now that the ground is finished, I add tiny details to the trees in the form of hanging skulls. I do this by taking very thin wire and wrapping it around the skull. Next, I twist the wire into a braid to make it look like rope, and just put a dab of super glue on the thread to make sure the skull is firmly attached. And after making just a few of these, I wrap the braids around the branches and then glue them into place. With the base complete, I let it dry out overnight and give it a zenithal with gray instead of white to make sure that the base is just a bit darker than the model. I want to avoid taking too much attention away from the main body while still getting a gradient for contrast paints. And just to push up the highlight just a little bit more, I do use an ivory from Pro Acryl and just dry brush the entire scene over. Next, I just want to black out the colors. I use a series of contrast paints for this, starting with Darkwood from Army Painter for the ground covering. And then next, I hit the wood beams with Contrast Wildwood from Citadel range. For the roof, I use Beowulf Blue from Army Painter, and just try to be neat not to overspill onto the wood details here. Moving on to the fleshy mouth bits, I use several layers of familiar pink watered down just to give a good kind of fleshy variation to those bits. And then of course we're bringing out the slaughter red again. We do put those on the ropes on the corners as well as the decorative beams of the main structure. Moving on to the bones, I just use Pro Ivory from Pro Acryl, just kind of focusing on the tops of the bones to add some highlights. But this does make them very bright and doesn't add a lot of variety. So what we're going to be doing is adding really watered down Nagash crochet just to darken down the ground. And we water it down a little bit more, probably about 3 parts water to wash, just to put it over all of the bones. And we want to do the same thing with a green. And the more of these kind of watered down colors that you can add to the bones just adds more and more visual interest, so that when you're really looking at it, you're going to see like kind of green weathered, brown weathered effects. And you could add more if you wanted. Sometimes a little bit of red would work just fine. I didn't use that here. That is a great tip for weathering that I recommend you do. Now that the model is painted, I move on to the bloody water that surrounds it. I want to start by building up a glowing red effect around the edge of the island. For this, I just use a very, very watered down Mephiston red over multiple passes to kind of build up a gradient. You don't necessarily need to be neat here. The super smooth gradient and transition isn't necessary, just because of how we want to finish this model, but just getting the general value shift is what we're after. Now, after that dries completely, I do use a UV cure resin to form kind of like a thicker transparent layer to the water. Just want to be safe with resin, I use gloves and let it cure completely before moving on, where we just put a layer of gloss Mod Podge on the surface. Now, as you can see, I kind of stippled this in a rough motion just to add some texture, but this does take a very long time to dry. Probably took about 3 to 4 hours is how long I had to wait before I came back to this, where I do the final step, which is just using the best paint Games Workshop has ever made. Blood for the Blood God is the best technical paint, and we're going to do the same thing, rough motions over the surface just to kind of emulate ripples and give it a bit of texture. Now that does take a little bit of time to dry as well, but after that is finished, we just paint the rim black, and that is complete on the base. And now that we have finished painting the model and the base, I glued them together and we are left with this. Thank you for watching the video. This project was a lot of fun and it turned out better than I could have hoped. If you like what you saw, please like and subscribe to the channel. Every bit helps me grow and get more of my content out there. And if you want a model like this, please check out the link in my profile to my commission page and website. Again, thanks so much for watching and have a great rest of your day.